After e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and d4, the Scotch game is on the board. Okay, we take the pawn, and after knight takes back, we attack the knight further. So we got two pieces attacking it. And now white plays bishop to e3, and as mentioned in previous videos, queen to f6. Now, the move we're going to go through, which we need to introduce as of this video, is c3. This is the main move, so it's very important to go through. It's the move you'll see most often. Now, the move to continue now, and this is very important to understand how to take this game, is queen to g6. Attacking a pawn already and putting pressure on g2. So this is doing two things at the same time. It stops this bishop from developing, and it's putting pressure on this pawn, making white potentially compromise the situation, because the queen side is already compromised when it comes to castling. The c pawn was moved. The king side, which is most often where the opponent king will want to castle, is under a threat of potential weakness. So for example, g3 would be bad because you'd already lose the pawn in e4. f3 will make this castle not very safe, although f3 is one of the main moves. And let's see now how white reacts. There's many moves we're going to go through. There's just too many different options. It's an open game, so a lot of things can happen. We're going to look at how all the setups look like. Let's start, for example, with queen to d3. Queen to d3 is a move where the opponent is playing a piece to defend the pawn, which means that we're going to have to keep targeting. So knight to f6, now we've got two pieces attacking it. We want to provoke f3. Let's look at this move now though. Knight takes in c6 with an attack on the bishop, especially because you have to be careful when you play a move like knight f6. The queen is no longer defending the square of c6, which means that the queen will not be able to go to c6 to defend your own bishop. So now your bishop is under attack. Two things you got to remember about the Scotch game is that when the white knight takes you in c6, this knight's attacking nothing and is threatening nothing from that square. So you can afford to leave it there for a turn. And bishop here taking in e3 is often the best move because white will take back with the pawn and it's really ugly. Double isolated pawn. Although in this case white has a queen to defend. So let's look at it. Bishop takes e3. We had to play this move because our bishop was loose. Queen takes back. And now we recapture the knight with the b pawn. This is the only scenario in which we will see something like this because it's going to be good to play bishop to e6 potentially, but not necessarily. The thing is we still want to preserve the possibility to play d5 because we are putting pressure on e4. So that's why taking with the d pawn would never allow us to play d5 ever. So take with the b pawn. And now let's develop pieces for white. Knight to d2, still not the bishop because the g2 pawn is not poisoned, remember. So one of the crucial lessons about this is that the g2 pawn is not poisoned. You can take it. Castle, and after bishop to d3 in this case, let's see. Yes, again, this pawn is not poisoned and we don't even care that the rook will come on the saved file of our queen soon enough. White castles long. It looks like the white player has a compensation for the lost pawn with development, but that's not true because our pieces are very well placed. Knight to g4 should put an end to this game. Knight to g4 now. Let's say the queen goes away. Let's say queen to c5, just to make an example. Knight to f2 just wins. The reason is you're going to be winning the exchange. And it's not like you can get attacked. Let's say rook to g1 with an attack on the queen, because you can play knight d3 check and win the queen. So that's just an example. In this position, after knight g4 attacking the queen, if queen just goes back to e2, then knight to e5. The idea is, of course, to take that bishop. We're going to go to the open endgame with the bishop against the knight, which should be better for black. It is better for black. So let's see, for example, if white just attacks our queen with this rook, the reason not with this rook, because then you will be able to play, you'll be able to take the other pawn. Just to make an example, queen to f2 should finish this game, because now white has nothing. There's no like sacrifices, attacks, or anything. The queen taking our queen means that means that we will be able to take the knight. And queen taking queen doesn't work because obviously knight d3 wins a piece and then recaptures the queen. And obviously in this position, if white attacks with the other rook, same thing. Queen takes f2, just does everything. And in this position, if white tries something like bishop to c2, simply saving the bishop. Queen to g5 now, very quietly, is the best move. Pinning the knight and carrying on with this game with an advantage. The advantage is not massive because there's a lot of things that can happen. It's an open endgame and there were a couple of initial swaps that made the game more quiet. But let's see after the best moves, rook d to f1, threatening f4, queen to f4, simply keeping pressure on this knight, pinning it. The idea is to play a5 and then bishop a6, winning the game. So after king b1, I'm pinning the knight, d6, finishing development at least. Now the bishop is able to reach 2 different diagonals. After h4, the only move that makes sense here to play h5, h6 and opening the files for the rook. a5 with the threat of bishop a6 winning because of too much attack. So after bishop a6, c4 is not going to be enough, also because of d5. Bishop b3 doesn't work because of a4. Now nothing stops you now from playing bishop a6 and winning this game. The bishop will have to move back. So if instead the rook in f goes to g1 on file of our king, these are just example removing itself from the skewer. Bishop a6 comes, the queen will have to move but also defend the knight. There's no attacks here. Queen h5 does nothing, it threatens nothing, so queen e1, but now knight to d3, forcing a swap, also because of the attack on f2, and the position is like evaluated like -3, has been evaluated -3 or -4 at this point for black for quite a few moves. So let's look at another setup. From the start, e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4. Okay, take, bishop c5, and now white keeps defending, and then queen f6, triple attack on the knight, so c3. And now the crucial move, queen to g6. What happens when this is met with bishop to d3, ignoring the pawn in g2? Again, just to prove the point that this is not a poison pawn. Queen to g2, and now after rook f1, only move, unless white wants to simplify and play queen to f3, but then in that case you just swap everything, and the white player will be down. Let's say, for example, queen f3, right? You can swap, knight takes back, and after this takes and this takes, black is up a pawn, and also white has this ugly pawn structure. There's absolutely zero compensation. In this position, after rook to f1, saving the rook, knight to f6. And again, there's no compensation. Let's look at two options now. One of them will be knight to f3 with the idea of playing rook to g1. Just so you know, this loses immediately because of bishop takes in e3. And the idea of rook to g1 fails because queen f2 will be checkmate. That's already not possible. The pawn will have to take back. But now, queen takes b2, trapping the opponent rook. Unless knight to d2, right? The rook is no longer trapped. But still, queen takes c3 with an attack on the bishop. Position evaluated -4. White has given up every take. No compensation at all. So in this position, after rook f1, knight to f6, let's look at the other option, queen to e2, the idea of playing knight b2, and then long castle and develop, as it's usually done for the sake of compensation in development. Knight to g4 comes now. And now removing the bishop from e3 means double attack on the knight in d4. Should be an easy win for black at that point. Instead of, if development comes, knight to d2, well, knight takes h2 wins the exchange. There's no good move for this rook. The best move according to the engine for white is the only move, castle long. But now simply take the rook, you're winning the exchange. And after the rook takes back, knight to e5 puts black in a much better situation. We're going to win the bishop f, simplifying the endgame where we are up 2 pawns and the exchange. Even if white retreats the bishop in order not to lose the bishop pair, the thing is this rook is completely useless. So black goes on with d6, and f4 can never happen because you will just trade queens. If queen goes to h5 with some idea of playing maybe f4, the knight is defending the rook. Everything is kind of defended for white if you think about it. Black now tries to force a trade of queens, queen to g4. If that happens, then black goes on to win the very easy endgame. If queen, let's say queen to h2, escaping the swap, queen h3, and the swap is inevitably going to happen. If queen to f4 now, still trying to avoid, then bishop d7, and now the knight in d2 can't move because the rook will be lost. So after rook to g1, allowing development of the knight somewhere, black goes on with long castle. Black is 100% safe. Position evaluated -4, and we don't have to worry about the pawn in g7, for example, because queen h1 is a massive threat. The only way to block without a piece being taken completely for free will be bishop to d1, but then that happens that we just win the queen. So none of those options are possible. Let's move on. Let's look at this other variation, the one with queen to c2. So d4, take, bishop c5, bishop e3, queen f6, c3, main move. Okay, queen g6, and now queen to c2, protecting the pawn. This is met with the usual knight f6. Now, when the opponent is using the queen, like a piece, to defend this pawn, feel free to attack that pawn more. Whereas when something is defended by a pawn, of course you might stop thinking about it too much because it's just too well defended. It's basic tactic approach. Any good tactical player should know that, because we know that this queen is not going to be employed to defend this pawn forever. Anyway, let's look at this setup. Knight takes knight. Now here, as mentioned, in this type of scenario, you take the bishop, okay? Pawn takes back because this knight can't do anything. Now we take the knight with the d pawn. This pawn in the center is already been damaged. We don't really need to play something like d5 because that will just help the opponent. However, in this case, the white player did manage to achieve the fact that this bishop can freely move, since the queen in c2 is the protector of g2 in this case. How to continue? Let's say bishop to d3, threatening e5, winning for white. Black plays knight to g4, which means that e5 is not a problem now. But let's look at two options now. If white plays, let's say, queen to e2 to defend the pawn in e3, because the knight landing in e3 would be just too strong. Okay, now we take the pawn in h2. Boom! What a move. This is so beautiful. Of course, rook taking is not worth saying because queen g3 recaptures the rook with happy material. So at this point, after e5 attacking the queen, still queen to g3 is coming anyway. That was inevitable. After queen f2, swap everything. You're winning this endgame. Knight to g4, you will also capture the pawn in e5. Zero compensation. Just like a poor guy that can't afford a lawyer in a case he should have won. So in this position, after knight g4, instead of queen e2, what happens after the immediate e5? This looks more interesting because we don't have that knight h2 tactic anymore, since we have the bishop attacking our queen immediately. Queen to g5, putting double attack on this pawn, and we're going to win it no matter what. There's nothing now. Whatever, we are going to win this pawn, and white will have an isolated e5 pawn. Much better endgame chances for black if white just pushes the pawn in order not to lose it. Still, queen e3 is happening. Check. Well, blocking with the bishop is really silly because queen to f2 check and king moving to d1 means knight to e3 wins the queen because it will be a fork, as you can see. If instead in this position after king to f1, well, black plays bishop to e6, position evaluated around minus 550 or something like that. The idea of the black play is to simply play long castle and put double attack on the bishop in d3. This bishop will not be able to go to this square e2 at all because queen f2 will be mate. So even after bishop e6, if white plays h3 attacking the knight to get rid of this knight, you will simply take the pawn in e5. Again, with a double attack on the bishop, you're completely winning the endgame. If instead white suggests to swap queen to e2, as he might desperately do, queen f4 check. And if the king moves, queen to c1 is mate in 3. The queen will have to block, but then queen e3 and then checkmate next. And after the queen f4 check, if queen blocks in f3, it gives birth to a similar scenario. Queen to c1 is not going to lead to checkmate, but then you're going to take in b2, you're going to take the rook, game over. And in this position after queen e3 check, even if queen goes to e2 straight away, it doesn't help. Queen to c1 is too strong. King can't go to f2, so after queen blocks, queen takes in b2, attacking the rook, should be win material, a lot of material. Knight going to d2, saving the knight and the rook. Queen takes in c3 with an attack on the bishop, no compensation. After h3, for example, knight to e3 attacking the queen. The queen has to move, but then black is just winning the bishop in d3. Queen e2 is not possible because he will take the rook, and if queen to b1 defending the bishop, saving the queen from the attack of a knight, and also defending the rook in a1, then knight to g2 check. King has to move. King to f2 is not possible because you will be taking the knight with check and saving your knight. So after king to e2, defending the knight, knight to f4 check, double attack on the bishop. The king will have to move, and then you will be able to win a free bishop. If king to e3, attacking the knight and putting extra defense to the bishop, queen to c5 is the death blow. After king takes knight, queen f2 check. The king is going to go into our territory. This bishop is super effective. The queen is super strong, and these pawns will be able to checkmate the king sooner than you think. If white blocks it, then g5 is coming, sacrificing. Boom. After the only move, which is king takes pawn, queen to g3 is check. The king is forced to go to either f6, h6, or the king is forced to go either to h5, h6, or f6. If king goes to, let's say, h6 or f6, then queen g6 is mate. If king goes to h5, take the knight with check, king h4, queen f4 check, king has to move, and now rook to g8 involves the piece missing that will allow us to checkmate. Rook to g1, defending the mate for the moment, is met with the lovely rook to g6 move. What a move, what a move. The idea is rook to h6 checkmate, and this cannot just be taken because rook takes means take back, and that's mate.